She had a one-way ticket back to Philadelphia hidden inside her corset. Evelyn Harper stood on that Wyoming train platform in 1883, dust coating her good traveling dress, staring at the man she had agreed to marry, and felt her stomach drop straight through the earth. He was not what she imagined, not even close. The letters had promised her a partner. What she got was a wall of silence wrapped in a dirty canvas coat. She had 72 hours to disappear before the wedding. What she didn't know was that walking away would have been the worst mistake of her life. If this story already has you hooked, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see just how far this story travels. The train had been moving for 3 days. 3 days of coal smoke and rattling glass, and the smell of unwashed strangers packed into narrow wooden seats. 3 days of watching the country change outside her window. The way the manicured green of Pennsylvania slowly gave way to something raw, something without manners, something that didn't apologize for its emptiness. By the time the locomotive groaned into Casper Station, Evelyn Harper had already read every letter Silas Boone had ever sent her, no fewer than 4 times each. She knew those letters almost by heart. "I won't pretend the work is easy," he had written in the very first one, responding to her advertisement in the Eastern Correspondence Gazette, an ad she had placed on a dare, half drunk on sherry, at her friend Margot's dinner party, and then spent 3 mortifying weeks hoping nobody she knew would find out about. The land here is honest in a way that city life sometimes isn't. It asks everything of you, and what it gives back is yours in a way that can't be taken. She had read that line 6 times before she wrote back. Most of the men who responded to women's advertisements in those papers were either desperate or dishonest, and it usually took about 2 exchanges to figure out which. There was a banker from St. Louis who spent 4 letters describing his house before he once asked her a single question about herself. There was a farmer from Ohio who wrote in sentences so clipped and practical they might as well have been grocery lists. There was a widower from Tennessee who seemed perfectly nice and completely unbearable. And then there was Silas Boone of Crook County, Wyoming. He asked her questions, real ones. Not, "Are you a good cook?" or "Do you manage a household well?" The kind of questions that dressed up inventory checks in polite language. He asked her what she thought about the railroad expansion and whether she believed it would ultimately help or hurt small landowners in the long term. He asked what books she was reading and whether she found them worthwhile or just fashionable. He told her about a hawk he'd watched for 3 consecutive mornings from his porch, and the way it hunted, and what it made him think about patience. He was, in short, nothing like what she expected a Wyoming rancher to be. And so Evelyn Harper, educated at the Philadelphia Academy for Young Women, fluent in French, opinionated about politics in a way that made dinner parties uncomfortable, 29 years old, and rapidly running out of patience for men who needed her to be smaller, had written back, and kept writing back, and eventually, after 11 months of letters, agreed to come west and marry him. She had told herself it was practical. She had told herself she was being modern and rational about the institution of marriage. She had told herself that a man you could have a real conversation with was rarer than love, and more durable besides. What she had not told herself, what she refused to examine too closely in the weeks before her departure, was that she had also imagined him, conjured him, really, built a picture of Silas Boone out of his words the way you might build a house out of good lumber, and she had been living inside that picture for nearly a year without realizing it. The picture had him taller than average, but not imposing, dark hair maybe, clean-shaven, or close to it. The kind of face that looked like it knew things, serious but not unkind. The hands of a working man, yes, but she was not unreasonable, not dirty, not permanently dirty. She had that picture firmly in her mind when she stepped off the train at Casper Station with her 2 trunks and her traveling case and her very best green dress, the one with the mother-of-pearl buttons. Then she saw him. He was standing apart from the small crowd on the platform, which is how she knew it was him. He told her he would hold a piece of paper with her name on it, and he was holding it, a folded square of brown paper with Harper written on it in large plain letters, no flourishes. He was holding it down at his side like he'd forgotten it was there, scanning the passengers coming off the train with an expression that was impossible to read. He was enormous. That was the first thing. Not tall in the way she'd imagined, not a refined sort of tall, but broad and physical in a way that announced itself. His shoulders looked like they had been installed for a different, heavier purpose than just carrying a coat. He had a beard that had clearly not seen a barber in some time, reddish-brown and growing its own opinions about direction. His hat was battered almost beyond recognition. His coat was canvas, dirty canvas, and his boots were the boots of a man who had walked across a great deal of mud and stopped caring about it. He had not dressed up. The thought arrived like a small, cold stone dropping into still water. He had known she was coming. He had known the date and the time and the train number, and this was what he had chosen to wear to meet the woman he intended to marry. Evelyn stopped walking. A man behind her with a carpet bag bumped into her back and muttered an apology, stepping around her. She barely heard it. She was standing in the middle of the platform with her traveling case in one hand and 3 days of soot on her dress, staring at Silas Boone, and she was thinking, with a clarity that surprised her with its cruelty, "I cannot do this." He spotted her before she could turn around. Not that she would have turned around. She was not a woman who turned around. But she thought about it. She had approximately 4 seconds to think about it before his eyes found her across the platform. Gray eyes, she noticed involuntarily, pale gray and direct in a way that was almost rude. And he raised the piece of paper slightly and started toward her. His walk was unhurried. That was the other thing she noticed in spite of herself. He didn't rush. He moved through the crowd the way water moves around stones in a creek, steady and without apology, and people shifted out of his path without appearing to notice they were doing it. He stopped in front of her and looked at her for a moment that lasted slightly too long. "Miss Harper," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected. Not performatively low, just low, like the bottom register of something. "Mr. Boone," she said. A pause. "Train was on time," he said. "It was." Another pause. He glanced at her trunks, which a porter was wrestling onto a cart nearby. "Both of those yours?" "Yes." He nodded as though this confirmed something he'd already calculated. Then he turned and walked toward the porter without another word, and Evelyn stood there holding her traveling case and understood, with perfect, awful clarity, that she had made a catastrophic error in judgment. The wagon ride to the hotel, she had insisted, in her last letter, on one night in town before the journey to the ranch, and he had agreed without argument, took 12 minutes. She knew because she counted them. He did not attempt conversation. He drove the horses with the focused economy of someone who had done it 10,000 times and found nothing interesting about it anymore. And Evelyn sat beside him on the bench with her back very straight and her hands folded in her lap and her mind moving fast and quiet behind her face. She was not panicking. She was planning. The plan was still vague. It was barely a plan, really, more of a direction, but its shape was becoming clearer with each minute of silence. She had money. Not a great deal, but enough. She had the return portion of her rail ticket, which she had purchased herself and told nobody about, tucked into the inside pocket of her corset case, with her spare hairpins and the small bottle of lavender water her mother had pressed into her hands at the Philadelphia station, with an expression that might have been pride or might have been pity, and was probably both. She could be back on a train by tomorrow afternoon. She would need an excuse. A health matter, perhaps. She was not above a strategic headache. Or she could simply be honest. She had made a decision that did not suit her upon reflection, and she was exercising her right to unmake it. She was a grown woman of 29. She had not signed anything. The letters were not a contract. She was still composing the explanation in her head when the wagon stopped in front of a 2-story building with a painted sign that read, "Kellerman's Hotel and Boarding, Clean Rooms." And Silas Boone climbed down and came around to her side and held up his hand to help her down. She looked at his hand for a half-second too long. It was, she noticed, clean. The nails were short. There was a scar along the outside of the palm, pale and old, running from his little finger to his wrist. It was the hand of someone who worked hard and apparently washed. She took it. It was brief and impersonal, and he released her the moment she was on the ground. "Dinner at 6 if you're hungry," he said. "Place next door's decent. You can find me there." "Thank you." He carried both her trunks upstairs himself without being asked. Her room was small and clean and smelled of cedar and old wood and something floral she couldn't identify. There was a window that looked out over the street, and she stood at it for a while after the door closed, watching the town, such as it was, go about its afternoon. Casper, Wyoming in 1883 was not Philadelphia. This was not a revelation that required stating, but standing at that window, it became viscerally, unavoidably true in a way the maps and letters and train schedules had not prepared her for. The street was unpaved. The buildings were practical and unadorned, built with the energy of people who needed walls and a roof and had no patience left over for anything else. Men in working clothes moved with purpose. A dog trotted past with something dead in its mouth. Somewhere nearby, a blacksmith was making an argument with a hammer. Evelyn turned away from the window and sat on the edge of the bed. She took out her last letter from Silas. She always kept the most recent one accessible, and read the part she always came back to. "I know what people think of this territory," he had written 3 months ago, in response to something she'd said about her family's concerns. "They think it's a rough place for rough people, and I won't say they're entirely wrong about that. But rough and worthless aren't the same thing, and neither are simple and stupid, though it's a mistake a lot of educated people make. I'd rather have one honest conversation about real things than 100 polished ones about nothing. I suspect you know what I mean." She had thought, when she first read that, "Yes, I know exactly what you mean." She folded the letter and put it back in her case. Then she sat there for a while and was honest with herself in the way she rarely allowed. The truth was that the letters had been a kind of dream. Not dishonest. She didn't think Silas had been dishonest, but a dream nonetheless. She had fallen in love, if that was even the right word, with a version of him that existed on paper, a version without a body, without a presence, without the particular reality of being very large and somewhat dirty and absolutely silent on a wagon bench for 12 unbroken minutes. She had not expected to feel afraid of him. That was the thing she didn't want to name. It wasn't quite fear. He hadn't done anything frightening exactly. He had been perfectly civil, but he was so much physical presence, and she was accustomed to men who carried their authority in their words and their titles and their social positions, men whose power was legible to her because she'd grown up reading that particular language. Silas Boone's authority came from something else entirely, something she didn't have a name for yet, and the unfamiliarity of it had her skin prickling in a way she resented. She was not a woman who was frightened by the unfamiliar. She had always prided herself on that. And yet, she set her jaw and went to wash her face and change for dinner. The restaurant next door was called, with impressive practicality, Olson's Eating House, and it was warm and smelled of beef and wood smoke and fresh bread, which improved her mood marginally. Silas was already at a table by the window. He had, she noticed, washed his face and combed his hair, which was darker than the beard, nearly brown. He had not changed his coat but had removed it, and the shirt beneath it was clean. He stood when she came in. She hadn't expected that. "Miss Harper." He pulled out the chair across from him with one hand. "You don't need to stand," she said, and immediately felt like an idiot for saying it, because of course he knew that, and she had just pointed out that she'd noticed it, which was worse. "My mother would disagree," he said, without any particular expression, and sat back down. They ordered. A woman named Agnes, presumably Mrs. Olson or a relation, brought them coffee without being asked and a basket of bread that was still warm. Evelyn pulled her napkin into her lap and tried to decide how to begin. "The town is smaller than I'd pictured," she said. "It's grown some last few years." He broke a piece of bread without looking at it, his eyes moving briefly to the window, then back to her. "Railroad did that. 10 years ago, there was maybe a quarter of what's here now." "And your ranch? How far is it from town?" 3 hours. Good weather. Closer to 4.5 once the winter roads come in." She absorbed this. "So in winter, you're essentially cut off?" "Not entirely. Just slower. You can always get out if you need to." He picked up his coffee. "Takes more effort." She nodded and looked at her hands. "You're quiet," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation, stated without judgment, which somehow made it worse. She looked up. "I'm thinking." "About what?" She considered briefly several polite deflections. Then she put them aside. If she was going to have a conversation worth having, she might as well have it. "About whether I've made a terrible mistake," she said. The directness of it surprised even her. Across the table, Silas Boone put down his coffee and looked at her with those pale gray eyes, and she could not read him at all, which was terrifying, and she held his gaze anyway. "Have you?" he asked. "I don't know yet. That's what I'm trying to determine." Something moved across his face. Not offense. She was watching for offense, and it wasn't that. Something quieter and harder to name. "Fair answer," he said. "You're not—" She stopped. "Not what?" "You're not offended." He considered this like it was a real question deserving real consideration. Would being offended change anything? Most men would be. Most men ask a woman to travel 1,000 miles and then get offended when she wants to know what she's arrived at. He shook his head slightly. "That seems backward to me." Agnes arrived with 2 plates, beef, potatoes, something green that may have been beans, and set them down with efficient efficiency. Neither of them spoke until she was gone. "The letters," Evelyn said. "They were—" She searched for the word. "They were very good. The letters were very good. I meant everything in them." "I believe you did." She looked at him. "That's not the problem." "Then what is?" She pressed her lips together for a moment. "I built a picture," she said finally, "of what you would be, what this would be. And the picture and the reality they're not matching up yet, and I find that more difficult than I expected to." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, someone laughed loudly on the street. "You thought I'd be different," he said. "Yes." "Different how?" She hesitated. The honest answer was softer, less physical, less impenetrable, more like the men she knew, whose social performances she could decode without effort. She had the feeling that saying any of this would sound exactly as shallow as it was. "Different," she repeated. He seemed to accept this. He picked up his fork and ate for a moment in silence, and Evelyn followed suit because the food was, in fairness, quite good. "Miss Harper," he said after a while, "I'm not going to tell you what to do. That's not how I think about things. You came a long way, and that took courage, and I'm grateful for it. But if you decide you want to go home, I'll drive you back to that station myself." He said it without drama, like a thing that was simply true. "What I will say is that I'd like you to come to the ranch first. Give it a week. You can decide anything you want to decide after that." She looked at him. "A week?" she said. "A week." She reached for her coffee. The cup was heavy and plain, and the coffee was black and strong and tasted nothing like what she drank in Philadelphia. "All right," she said. "A week." She didn't sleep well. The room was fine, genuinely fine. The bed was decent and the cedar smell was pleasant, but her mind refused to settle. Kept cycling back through the dinner, pulling apart each small exchange, looking for evidence of things she couldn't name. She was trying to decide if she was afraid of Silas Boone because he was frightening, or because he wasn't what she'd expected, or because he was exactly what his letters had suggested and she simply hadn't been ready for what that looked like in a body. She also kept thinking about the thing he'd said without saying it, that he would take her back without argument if she asked. She had expected, at minimum, some effort at persuasion. A man who had been corresponding with a woman for 11 months, who had presumably made some arrangement in his mind about his future, would be expected to put up at least a gentlemanly argument when that future threatened to board a train back to Pennsylvania. She had prepared, half-consciously, for that argument. She had her responses ready. The absence of the argument left her with nothing to push against, and it was, she discovered, profoundly disorienting. Either he was a man of exceptional restraint and principle, or he didn't particularly care. She lay in the dark and turned those 2 possibilities over and over until sometime past midnight, when she finally fell into a shallow, restless sleep and dreamed of Philadelphia. The familiar streets, her mother's parlor, the smell of her old bedroom, with a longing so sharp it woke her up. She lay in the dark after that and stared at the ceiling. The ticket was still in her case. A week, she told herself. 1 week is nothing. You can survive 1 week. She was not sure, in the cold dark of that small Wyoming room, whether she was talking herself into staying or just delaying the moment of leaving, and she had enough honesty left to admit she didn't know the difference. Morning came gray and windy, and Silas was waiting in front of the hotel with the wagon at 7, as he'd said he would be. He had her trunks loaded before she reached the bottom step. She had dressed carefully. Not her best, she wasn't an idiot, but cleanly and practically, with her warmest traveling coat and her hair pinned up close against the wind, which was already making a point about Wyoming's opinions on tidiness. She had eaten a quick breakfast alone in the hotel dining room, which had given her time to regret her agreement in quiet and then push the regret down to somewhere manageable. He handed her up into the wagon without comment. They left Casper as the sun was coming up properly, burning through the gray in strips of orange and flat gold that fell across the land in a way she had to admit was striking, even if she would not have said so out loud. The road north was rough and unpaved and demanded the wagon's full attention. For the first hour or so, she watched the country unreal on either side of them. The dry grass, the sage, the distant shape of hills that might have been mountains or clouds or both, and said nothing. Then she said, "What's the land like at the ranch?" He glanced at her, a quick sideways look. "Rolling," he said. "Some flat ground to the north, good grass. Creek runs through the south pasture most of the year. Higher ground in the back, pines on the ridge." A pause. "Good land. Not easy, but good. How long have you had it?" 7 years. Bought it from a man named Garrett who wanted to go to California. He built the main house. I've added to it since." "How many cattle?" He told her. She listened. She had done enough reading in the months before she came that the number meant something to her. It told her the rough scale of the operation, the kind of labor it required, the financial picture it suggested. He seemed slightly surprised when she asked a follow-up question that demonstrated she'd understood the first answer, but he didn't comment on it. They talked off and on through the morning. Not constantly. The road required attention, and so did the wind, which picked up as they traveled north. But in fits and starts, topic to topic, the way conversation goes when two people are still learning the shape of each other. He told her about the previous winter, which had been hard but survivable. She told him more than she'd intended about why she'd placed the advertisement in the first place, the accumulated frustration of years of conversations with men who treated her intelligence like a polite inconvenience. "Figured it couldn't be worse than what was in front of me," she said, and then immediately felt exposed having said it, and looked away. "And now?" His voice was neutral. He was watching the road. "Now I'm on a wagon in Wyoming." She looked at the land around them, the enormous flat emptiness of it, the sky so wide it seemed structural, holding something up. "Jury's still out." She caught the corner of something on his face that might, in better light, have been the beginning of a smile. She looked away before she could be sure. They arrived at the ranch in the late afternoon. It sat in a shallow valley between two long ridges, and the sight of it as they came over the rise stopped her breath for a moment. Not because it was beautiful, exactly, though parts of it were, but because of the sheer fact of it. The way it existed out here, solid and deliberate, a decision someone had made and kept making every day. The main house was larger than she'd imagined, 2 stories, with a wide porch facing south and windows that caught the last of the afternoon light. There was a barn to the east, and several outbuildings she couldn't name yet, and a fence line that ran out into the distance and disappeared. "It's bigger than I expected," she said. 7 years of adding to it, he said, with a quietness that might have been pride, or might have been something else. He stopped the wagon in front of the house and climbed down and came around, and she took his hand again, easier this time, just barely, and stepped down onto the Wyoming ground for the first time. It was different from the station. It was, she searched for the word. It was quieter. The wind was there, and somewhere a horse was making noise in the barn, and something wooden was creaking, but underneath all of it was a quiet so complete it felt almost solid. She stood in it for a moment without meaning to. "House keys on a nail by the door," Silas said, lifting her trunks from the wagon bed. "Front room's through there. Make yourself at home." He said it simply, like it was a simple thing. Make yourself at home. She stood on the Wyoming ground in the autumn afternoon light and looked at the house that was supposed to become her house, and felt the full complicated weight of the word home settle on her somewhere between her chest and her stomach. And she didn't move for a long moment, and Silas didn't rush her. Later, much later, she would mark this as the moment. Not any dramatic moment, not the rescue or the storm or any of the things that came after. Just this, standing in a quiet valley while a complicated, difficult, entirely real man carried her trunks without being asked and told her to make herself at home, and meant it without qualification. But she didn't know that yet. She was still planning to leave. She just hadn't decided exactly when. The first night in the ranch house, She lay awake for a long time. Her room was on the second floor, the room that had been, she gathered from the way it was arranged, kept clean and unoccupied and waiting without any drama. And she listened to the sounds of a place that was entirely unfamiliar. Wind, but different from the city. A long, flat sound, not the canyoned gusts between buildings. Something far away that might have been an animal. The creaking of the house itself, settling and expanding in a way the Philadelphia row house she grew up in never had. She thought about Margot, who had laughed when she first saw the advertisement. "You're not actually going to answer it," Margot had said, delighted and appalled. And Evelyn had said, "Of course not," and then gone home and answered it. She thought about her mother's face at the station, the way her mother had held her hands too long. She thought about 11 months of letters, and the man who had written them, and the man downstairs who she could hear moving around in the kitchen with the unhurried practicality of someone who knew exactly where everything was. She didn't take out the train ticket. She thought about it. She left it where it was. Outside the window, the Wyoming sky was enormous and black and packed with stars in a density she had never seen from a city, had not known was possible. Not art, not an exaggeration, just the actual sky with nothing between it and her eyes. She lay there and looked at it through the glass until her eyes grew heavy. The last thought she had before she finally slept was not about the ticket or the plan or what came next. It was about what he'd said at dinner, the things she kept coming back to. Most men ask a woman to travel 1,000 miles and then get offended when she wants to know what she's arrived at. That seems backward to me. She fell asleep still thinking about it. She had given herself a week. By the third morning, she had already stopped counting the days. It happened without announcement, without any particular moment she could point to afterward and say there, that was when things shifted. It was more gradual than that, and more unsettling because she had been so certain the counting would continue. She had the ticket, she had the plan. She had a very clear picture of herself boarding that train back to civilization with her dignity intact and a story to tell at dinner parties. The time I almost married a Wyoming rancher, can you imagine? And the picture had felt solid and sensible and correct. Then she woke up on the third morning to the smell of coffee already made and something else. Bread, she thought, or biscuits. And lay in the gray early light listening to the sounds of the ranch coming awake around her, and realized she hadn't thought about Philadelphia once since she fell asleep. She wasn't sure what to do with that, so she got up and went downstairs. Silas was at the stove. He was not a graceful cook. He moved around the small kitchen with a kind of focused efficiency that had nothing to do with elegance and everything to do with knowing exactly what he was doing. And he didn't hear her on the stairs, or if he did, he didn't show it. She stood in the doorway for a moment and watched him flip something in a cast-iron pan with the casual authority of someone who had been feeding himself in difficult circumstances for many years. "Coffee's on the left," he said, without turning around. "I see it," she said, and crossed to the stove and poured herself a cup, and stood there drinking it while he finished the biscuits and moved them to a plate and set the plate on the table. They ate breakfast in a quiet that was, she noticed, different from the silence of the wagon ride into town. That silence had been the silence of two strangers with nothing established between them. This one had a floor to it, something minimal but present, like the beginning of an understanding neither of them had named yet. "I'm going to check the south fence line this morning," he said, pouring more coffee. "You can come if you want." It was not an invitation exactly. It was more like an open door. He was telling her a thing that was happening, and if she chose to walk through, that was her decision. She had been noticing that about him over the first 2 days. He didn't ask her what she wanted in the indirect, performative way men usually did when they were actually telling her what they expected. He stated what he was doing and left space for her to choose. It was a small thing. It kept surprising her. "All right," she said. He handed her a second biscuit, and she took it without being asked if she wanted one, because she did. And they finished breakfast without much more conversation. And then she went upstairs and changed into the most practical clothes she'd brought, which were not quite practical enough, she was discovering, but she was managing, and went out to find him already at the barn. The morning was cold and bright and smelled of sage and horses and something clean she didn't have a word for yet. Her breath came out in small clouds. The sky above the ridge was the particular blue of high altitude in autumn, an impossible flat blue with no gradation, like someone had painted it on with one even stroke. He gave her a horse named Bess, which was a name so profoundly unimaginative she almost laughed, and didn't. Bess was a compact brown mare with a white blaze down her nose, and the particular patience of an animal that had spent a great deal of time around uncertain riders and made her peace with it. Evelyn had ridden. She'd grown up riding, had lessons at the academy, but Eastern riding and Wyoming riding were, she discovered in the first 100 yards, related disciplines in the way that swimming and drowning were related. Technically, the same medium, entirely different experience. She kept up. That was the important thing. She kept up, and she didn't complain, and when Bess spooked sideways at a jackrabbit that erupted out of the grass, Evelyn sat it without drama and got the horse settled and kept riding. Silas, slightly ahead of her, said nothing, but she saw him glance back. They rode south along a fence line that went further than she'd expected, out past a cluster of cottonwoods and down into a shallow draw where a creek ran quietly between frost-stiffened banks. He checked the posts as they went, testing each one with his hand. Not every post, she realized, but specific ones, the ones that looked to her identical to all the others. She couldn't figure out how he was selecting them. "How do you know which ones to check?" she asked. He looked up from a post he was examining. "Ground's softer in this section. Frost heaves them." He showed her, pressing his boot against the base of the post, which moved slightly. "See that? Another month, maybe 6 weeks, that'll be loose enough to push over. Cattle will walk right through." She looked at the fence, and then at the ground, and then at the surrounding landscape, trying to see what he saw. "How far does this go?" "This section? Another 2 miles south, then it cuts east along the ridge." He straightened up. "Whole perimeter's about 14 miles. You check 14 miles of fence. Not all at once. Different sections, different weeks." He moved to the next post. "You have to know your land, know which parts are going to give you trouble and get ahead of it. You wait until something breaks, you're already behind." She rode alongside him for a while and he talked. Not continuously, but more than he had at any point since she'd arrived, which she was beginning to understand was simply how he worked. He gave information when it was relevant. He didn't fill silence for the sake of filling it. In Philadelphia, she had known men who talked without stopping about things that interested nobody, including themselves. And she had always found it exhausting. Silas Boone said things that had content, and when he didn't have anything to say, he didn't say anything. And it had taken her 2 full days to stop interpreting that silence as hostility. He knew the land the way she knew books. Not just the facts of it, but the meaning behind the facts, the web of causes and consequences that connected everything to everything else. He talked about the creek and how it ran different in different seasons, and what that told him about the snowpack on the ridge. He talked about the grass and which sections came up earliest in spring and which grazed well and which were deceptive, looked good from a distance but ran thin, didn't have the root depth to sustain cattle through a dry stretch. He talked about the hawk she'd seen from the window that morning, identified it without binoculars from 50 yards, told her what it was hunting and why it was hunting in that particular spot. She found herself asking questions she hadn't planned to ask. At one point, he stopped his horse on a small rise and looked out over the land to the south, and she pulled up beside him, and they sat there for a moment looking at the same thing. The valley rolled away from them in shades of gold and brown and pale sage green, the distant ridge cutting a clean line against the sky. It was not a dramatic landscape. It didn't announce itself. But the more she looked at it, the more she could see the detail inside it. The way the colors changed, the different textures of grass and brush, the faint line of the creek threading through the lower ground. "My grandfather told me once that you don't really know a piece of land until you've been wrong about it," Silas said, still looking south. "Made a mistake about it, paid for the mistake, learned from what you paid." He said getting things right the first time just means you haven't been tested yet. He was a rancher too? "Farmer, Virginia, different land, same principle." He turned his horse back toward the fence line. "I've made plenty of mistakes out here. I expect I'll make more." She thought about that for the rest of the ride back. It was the most honest thing she had heard a man say in longer than she could remember. The days that followed arranged themselves into a shape she hadn't anticipated. There was a rhythm to ranch life that had nothing to do with the social rhythms she was accustomed to, no dinner calls or scheduled visiting hours or the elaborate choreography of Philadelphia's respectable classes. Instead, there was work, constant, various, physically demanding work. And the rhythm was the rhythm of what needed doing, which changed every day but also, in a deeper sense, never changed at all. She found herself drawn into it. Not by obligation, He didn't ask her to do anything, didn't give her tasks, didn't treat her arrival as a source of available labor. But there was something about watching a thing being done that needed doing and knowing you could help do it, and she was not, whatever else she was, a woman comfortable with sitting still. On the fourth day, she helped him repair a section of the barn roof that had developed a concerning relationship with the sky. She held boards and handed nails and climbed partway up the ladder before deciding that was enough climbing for a first attempt, and he didn't comment on where she stopped or suggest she go further. On the fifth day, she cooked dinner, actually cooked it, not a performance of cooking, but a real meal. A beef stew that took most of the afternoon and was, she would admit, slightly underseasoned because she'd misjudged the amount of salt relative to the pot size. He ate 2 bowls. She didn't say anything about it, and neither did he, which was, in its way, a kind of conversation. On the evening of the 5th day, they sat on the porch after dinner. It was cold enough for their breath to show, but not so cold it was unreasonable. And she had her coat wrapped around her and a cup of coffee that was going cool, and he was in his shirt sleeves in a way that suggested the cold registered differently for him than it did for her, and they sat for a while without talking and watched the stars come out. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask me anything. Did you think I was going to leave? That first night, when I said I didn't know if I'd made a mistake." He was quiet for a moment, a genuine quiet, not a stall. She was learning the difference. "I thought it was possible," he said. "You hadn't given me any reason to think otherwise." "But you didn't try to talk me out of it." "No." "Why not?" He looked at the sky for a moment before answering. "Because if you'd needed to be talked into staying, it wouldn't have held. Whatever kept you here had to come from you deciding it was worth staying for. Me making an argument for myself doesn't change what the actual situation is. You'd have figured that out eventually." A pause. "Better that you figure it out early." She looked at the side of his face. The beard she was getting used to, the strong line of the jaw beneath it, the gray eyes aimed at the horizon. "That's an unusual way to think about it. My father used to say that a man who has to sell himself probably isn't worth buying." He said it without pride, just recounting a thing. "I'm not sure I agree with everything he taught me, but that one stuck." She almost laughed. "That's either the most honest thing I've ever heard or the most arrogant." He turned and looked at her, and there it was. The thing she'd caught only the corner of in the restaurant. The thing she'd been half chasing ever since. The actual, full expression of him amused. It changed his face entirely. The beard couldn't hide it, and the seriousness couldn't contain it. It was quick, like light through clouds, and it was gone almost as fast as it appeared, but she saw it. "Maybe some of both," he said. She looked back at the stars before he could see whatever was on her face. The next morning, she stopped thinking about the train ticket entirely. She didn't make a decision about it. She didn't tell herself she was staying or revise any plan. She just stopped thinking about it, the way you sometimes stop thinking about a door after you've walked too far away from it to go back without turning the whole trip around. She was aware, in the back of her mind, that this was itself a decision. She let it be. What she began to see, over those first weeks, because the week extended itself by quiet consensus, no conversation about it, simply neither of them raising the subject of her departure, was that Silas Boone operated from a set of principles that were so consistent and so genuinely held that they had long since stopped being principles and become simply the way he moved through the world. He was not performing decency. He was not being strategic about his treatment of her. He just believed in it. The way he spoke to her, the way he made space for her opinions and didn't flatten them or redirect them or explain them back to her incorrectly with an air of authority, it wasn't a courtship behavior. It was just him. She caught this clearly one afternoon when one of his hands, a young man named Pete Callahan, 19 and enthusiastic and slightly more confident than his ability warranted, made some remark at lunch about women not being suited to the particular strain of financial thinking required for running a cattle operation. He said it without malice, just as a fact he'd been handed somewhere and hadn't thought to question. Evelyn had heard variations of it her entire adult life and had developed approximately 17 responses to it, ranging from polite deflection to precise and devastating counterargument, and she was selecting from among them when Silas said, without looking up from his food, "That's a stupid thing to say, Pete." Pete blinked. "Sir? It's a stupid thing to say. Think about what you just said and tell me what evidence you're basing it on." Pete opened his mouth and then closed it. He was clearly running through his evidence, which was apparently not robust. My dad always said, your dad was wrong about a few things. This is one of them. Silas picked up his coffee. Miss Harper has read more on agricultural economics than most men I know who've made the argument you just made. You might want to ask her opinion on the question before you repeat it. Pete looked at Evelyn with the expression of someone who had just been informed the floor wasn't quite where he thought it was. Yes, sir, he said. Silas went back to eating. Evelyn did not look at Silas. She ate her lunch and answered Pete's subsequent questions about beef prices with the care of someone who had decided not to make more of a moment than it needed to be. But she was aware of something settling in her chest. Not gratitude exactly, because it wasn't the kind of thing she wanted to feel grateful for. It was the kind of thing that should simply be true, but something adjacent to relief. The recognition of a thing she'd been looking for a long time and hadn't been sure existed. She caught him alone later in the barn and said without preamble, "You didn't have to do that." He was checking the hind foot of a horse and didn't look up immediately. Do what? This morning, with Pete. He said something false. He set the hoof down and straightened and looked at her. People shouldn't go around saying false things. Most men would have let it pass. I know. Something in his face went steady in a way that was different from his usual stillness, more deliberate. That's the problem. She stood in the barn doorway and looked at him and felt the picture she'd been carrying since Philadelphia, the carefully constructed image of who and what she'd expected, finally fully fall apart. Not dramatically. Not with grief exactly. The way a fog burns off in the morning, slowly, steadily, until you can see the actual landscape underneath. The actual landscape was a great deal more interesting than the fog. The weeks moved. October deepened and the light changed, going lower and more gold, the shadows getting longer earlier each afternoon. The aspens on the north ridge went fully yellow and then began to let go of their leaves, and on windy days they fell across the upper pasture in long drifts, and the cold sharpened its edge. She learned the ranch. Not all of it. There was more to know than she had imagined possible, more layers to the knowledge required to keep this particular piece of land and its animals alive through a Wyoming winter. But she was taking it in piece by piece, in the way she'd always learned things, by asking questions and paying attention and refusing to be embarrassed about what she didn't know yet. Silas answered every question she asked him. He never shortened the answer because she was a woman or might not understand. He gave her the full answer, all the complexity of it, and occasionally checked to make sure she'd followed, and when she asked follow-up questions, he answered those too. They talked about things that weren't the ranch. That was when she started to see the full shape of him. He had read widely, not the fashionable reading of someone performing intellect, but the real, hungry kind, the reading of a man who had spent many winters isolated and turned to books the way a person turns to windows in a closed room. He had opinions about economics and land policy and the railroad question that were specific and evidenced and sometimes wrong in interesting ways that opened up argument rather than closing it down. She disagreed with him on 2 major points in the first month and argued her position, and he argued back, and neither of them gave ground, and neither of them held it against the other. She had not had that kind of conversation since her time at the academy, and even there it had been rare. One evening in late October, they were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner. She had taken over most of the cooking by this point because he was better at everything else and it seemed like a reasonable distribution. And she was reading and he was going over some kind of accounts ledger with the focused unhappiness of a man who found the numbers unpleasant but did the work anyway. The fire in the stove was the only moving thing. Outside the wind was picking up. She looked up from her book and found him looking at her. Not a calculated look. Not a look that had any particular agenda in it, just looking the way you look at something that has become part of the room, part of the familiar arrangement of the space. He looked away when she met his eyes, back to the ledger, and didn't say anything. She looked back at her book. Her heart was doing something inconvenient. She did not address this. She turned her page and kept reading, and the fire ticked in the stove and the wind moved outside the walls of the house, and the silence between them was something she could have reached out and touched, something with texture and weight and warmth, entirely unlike the silence of the wagon bench on the first day. It was the silence of 2 people who had said enough to each other to be comfortable with not saying more. She had not expected to find that here. She had not expected to find it anywhere, if she was being honest, and the finding of it, unexpectedly, in a valley in Wyoming, with a man she had been so prepared to flee, had a quality she recognized from her reading but had not previously encountered in her own life. She thought about telling him something that evening. Several different things arranged themselves into words in her mind, things that were true and would have meant something to say. She didn't say any of them. She closed her book when the hour got late and said goodnight and went upstairs and lay in the dark listening to the wind pull at the corners of the house. But she wasn't thinking about the train ticket. She hadn't thought about it in weeks. They were married on a Saturday in early November, in the front room of the ranch house, with a circuit judge named Harlan Briggs, who smelled of pipe tobacco and traveled the county on a schedule that admitted no sentiment about weather or occasion. There were 4 witnesses. Pete Callahan, who stood very straight and looked like he was trying to make up for the lunch comment through the quality of his posture. A neighboring rancher named Douglas Webb and his wife Clara, who brought a jar of preserved plums and hugged Evelyn with the warmth of a woman who understood what it meant to be new to this land. And an older hand named Cutter, who said nothing but removed his hat with both hands and held it against his chest for the entire proceeding in a way that moved her more than she expected. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Silas said his words plainly, without stumbling, looking directly at her. She said hers the same way. They had not rehearsed. There was no music. When it was done, Harlan Briggs closed his book and shook Silas's hand and said, "Congratulations, Boone," and then looked at Evelyn and said, "Ma'am, this is a hard country, but it's an honest one." And she had the sense he meant it as a genuine compliment, which was so specifically Wyoming that she almost laughed. Clara Webb pressed her hand afterward and said quietly, "He's a good man. They're rarer than they look from the outside, the good ones." Evelyn looked across the room at Silas, who was talking to Douglas Webb about something. Cattle prices, she guessed, because it was always either cattle prices or fence lines, with his usual contained attention, and she thought, "I know." And then she thought, "I almost didn't stay long enough to find that out," and felt something cold move through her at the thought, brief and sharp, like a stone turned over to find the dark underneath. She put it away. She had gotten good at filing things in the place where they belonged and leaving them there. November settled in hard. The temperature dropped in a way that was less a gradual decline and more a decision the weather made one morning and didn't revisit. The sky took on a flat, pewter quality that the old-timers called the look of a winter that intended to stay, and they were right. It did. The work changed with it. Everything took longer in the cold. Equipment that functioned easily in October became argumentative and difficult in November, and the cattle required more attention, more feed, more checking. Evelyn worked alongside all of it. She had stopped, somewhere in the middle weeks of October, making any internal distinction between the work she was supposed to do and the work that was simply there to be done. She helped where she was useful. She stayed out of the way when she wasn't. She made mistakes and corrected them and didn't dwell on them beyond what was useful for not making them again. She and Silas had developed, without discussing it, a partnership that was different from what she'd imagined a marriage would look like. More practical, less ornamented, with its tenderness expressed in the texture of daily things rather than in any language she'd previously been taught to recognize as tenderness. He brought coffee to wherever she was working on cold mornings, always the right amount, black the way she took it. She kept track of the supply inventory in a ledger she'd organized herself, and when she identified a pattern that would save them money on their spring feed order, she showed him the calculation, and he looked at it for a long time and said, "I would have missed that," in a tone that meant exactly what it said. He was not easy. She wanted to be honest about that, at least to herself. He was private in a way that sometimes felt like a wall with no door in it. There were evenings when something was clearly sitting on him, some weight, some worry, some piece of the past she didn't have access to. And he carried it in silence, and her every instinct was to push at the wall, to find the door, to insist on being let in. She was learning, slowly and with effort, that the insisting didn't work, that the wall didn't come down because she demanded it, and that demanding it only built it higher. What worked, what she discovered almost by accident one evening in December when she simply sat next to him without asking anything, without filling the silence with questions, was just being there. Being present without agenda. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, and she was not always good at it, but she was getting better. December brought real snow. Not the tentative preliminary dusting of November, but the genuine committed snow of a Wyoming winter, falling with the quiet indifference of something that had no interest in anyone's opinion of it. It accumulated on the roof and weighed down the fence posts and turned the ranch into a world of sharp white edges and gray shadows. And the days shortened to a sliver of pale light between long, hard dark. She had not known, before this, what cold really was. Philadelphia winters were cold in the way a polite argument is unpleasant. Uncomfortable, certainly, but bounded, managed, fundamentally civilized. Wyoming cold was something else. It was the kind of cold that had no interest in your suffering and no capacity to care about it. It simply was. And you worked inside it, or you didn't work, and it didn't negotiate. She worked inside it. She wore every layer she had and added several borrowed from the ranch's supply of practical clothing, and she moved as fast as she could to generate heat, and she complained approximately twice, both times to herself and both times immediately afterward decided that the complaining was a waste of energy she didn't have to spare. It was during one of these cold December weeks that she started having the argument with herself about the fence line. The south fence, the long one she'd ridden with Silas back in October, the one with the soft ground and the heaving posts, had been on Silas's worry list since before the snow came in. He'd reinforced the worst sections in early November, but there was a stretch near the creek that he hadn't gotten to, and the freeze-thaw cycles since had been hard on it. He'd ridden out to check it twice in the past week, come back with his jaw set in the particular way that meant the news was not good, and added it to his already crowded list of things that needed doing before the next storm system came through. The problem was, the next storm system was coming through in about 48 hours. Cutter had a bad knee that had flared in the cold. Pete Callahan was down with something febrile that had turned his face the color of old tallow and confined him to the bunkhouse under Clara Webb's orders. She'd come by the day before to check on everyone and decreed it with the authority of a woman who didn't leave room for argument. Douglas Webb himself had ridden over that morning to borrow the larger of their 2 post diggers and mentioned in passing that his own place was behind in winter preparations, which told her that nobody in the county had enough hands or enough hours. Silas had gone into Casper that morning for a supply run he'd been putting off, a trip that would take most of the day. He'd left early, before light, with the list she'd helped him compile the night before, and told her he'd be back before dark. The fence sat in her mind all morning. She knew the route. She had ridden it twice since October, had memorized it in the thorough way she memorized things, and she knew the specific stretch near the creek that needed checking. She knew what to look for. Loose posts, the particular lean that meant the frost had gotten underneath the base. She had her horse. She had rope. She had the tools needed for a temporary brace if she found a post that had heaved too far. She also had enough self-awareness to know that she was constructing a justification, that she was taking a real and legitimate need. The fence genuinely needed checking, and using it to dress up something else, something that had been nagging at her since she arrived, the need to prove to herself that she belonged here, that she wasn't just a passenger in this life, carried along by circumstance and Silas's steady competence, but someone who could handle things, who could see what needed doing and do it. She sat with that for a while. Then she put on every layer she owned, told Cutter through the bunkhouse door where she was going, and went to saddle Bess. Cutter opened the bunkhouse door when he heard the horse. He was a lean, weathered man of 60-something who had been working this land longer than Silas had owned it, and he stood in the doorway in his long underwear and a blanket and looked at her on Bess with an expression that mixed concern and something else. Not disrespect, just the frank assessment of someone who'd seen a lot of things go wrong in this particular landscape. "South fence," he said. "The creek section." He looked at the sky. She looked at it too. It was the pewter gray of deep winter, opaque and low, without the specific texture that she'd learned meant snow was imminent. It looked the way it had looked for 2 weeks, cold and flat and committed. "Weather's holding," she said. "Weather's holding now," he said. "I know the route. I'll be back by 2. He rubbed his face with one hand, the gesture of a man who knew he didn't have the authority to stop her and was trying to decide if he had the standing to try anyway. "You tell Boone's horse if you're going south," he said finally. "Leave the sorrel in the paddock. He'll come home if something goes wrong." She frowned. "Why would I need—" "Just leave him in the paddock," Cutter said, and closed the bunkhouse door. She left the sorrel in the paddock. The ride south was longer in winter. The snow made everything slower. Bess picked her way carefully through the drifts, and there were places where the usual path was obscured and Evelyn had to read the landscape from memory and decide where the ground was. She had her scarf pulled up over her face and her hands were cold inside her gloves, but she was moving, generating heat, and the sky held. She found the first loose post about a mile before the creek and stopped to brace it, tying it to the adjacent post with rope in the configuration Silas had shown her. Her hands were clumsy with the cold by the time she was done. She flexed them inside her gloves, got the blood moving again, and kept going. The creek appeared through the trees, a line of cottonwoods, stripped bare now, their white trunks pale against the snow. And she followed the fence line down toward the crossing. This was the section she'd come for. This was where the ground went softer, where the frost worked differently than anywhere else on the property. She could see from 20 yards away that 2 of the posts were bad. More than bad. One of them had heaved fully out of true, leaning at an angle that would let a determined cow through with minimal effort, and the wire on that section had gone slack. She tied Bess to the fence wire, a firm section, tested it first, and climbed down and started working. She was 3/4 through the repair when she heard the ice. It was a sound she didn't have a reference for, a deep, structural groan from the direction of the creek, a sound like something large making a decision. She looked up. The creek was maybe 30 feet to her left, and from where she stood she could see the surface of it, frozen over, had been for weeks, the ice thick and pale with snow on top of it. She hadn't gone near the ice. She hadn't needed to. She went back to the post. She was tamping the base of the reset post with a fencing bar, working the frozen ground loose and then packing it back tight, when Bess shifted suddenly, pulling against the wire, and Evelyn took a half step back to balance herself and put her left foot through what she had been certain was solid snow-covered ground. The ground wasn't there. The bank had undercut. She understood this in the half second she had to understand anything. The creek had been eating at the bank beneath the snow, hollowing it from underneath, and the ledge she'd been standing on for the last 20 minutes had been getting narrower without showing it, and now there was nothing under her left foot, and her weight shifted and Bess pulled back in the opposite direction, and she was falling. She hit the ice. It held for 1 breath. 2. Then it gave. The cold was not what she expected. She had imagined cold water as an intensified version of cold, sharper, but recognizable. What she dropped into was something past temperature entirely, something that hit every nerve in her body simultaneously like a single enormous electric charge. And she gasped, and water went into her mouth, and she scrambled for the surface and broke through into the air and grabbed at the ice edge, which crumbled and grabbed again, and caught something. A root, a branch, something solid embedded in the bank. She held it, and pulled. And her arms were shaking, and her legs were already going distant and wrong in the way she dimly understood, meant the cold was inside her now, working, and she pulled again and got herself far enough up to get her elbow onto solid ice. Not the hollowed section, but further up, and she hauled herself out and lay face down in the snow on the bank. She lay there for several seconds, long enough to understand she was out, long enough for the cold air to feel warm by comparison to the water, which it wasn't, but the body makes those assessments incorrectly in extremity. Then she pushed herself up and stood and looked down at herself. She was soaked through every layer she was wearing, every single layer, from the outermost coat to the underlinen, saturated with creek water in the 38 degrees of temperature. She could feel the cold already moving through it, heat leaching out in every direction, her body's core trying to pull warmth from her extremities and finding less and less to work with. Bess was still tied to the fence, pulling against the wire and showing the whites of her eyes. Evelyn went to her, untied the lead, and stood in the snow and tried to think. She was 4 miles from the ranch house. In dry clothes and good conditions, on horseback, that was under 30 minutes. In saturated clothing, in current conditions, stopping to work would have stolen time, and the cold was accelerating. She could feel it. It wasn't the discomfort of being cold anymore. It was something with a different quality to it, a dullness settling into her hands, a heaviness in her limbs that had nothing to do with effort. She had to move. Moving was the only option. She got a foot in the stirrup. Her boot was full of water and her foot already half numb, and she missed the first attempt and grabbed the saddle horn and tried again and got up. And Bess, feeling the change in her rider, settled slightly, the way horses sometimes do when they sense that their person needs steadiness. "Come on," Evelyn said, and turned Bess north. She knew she was in real trouble by the time she'd gone a mile. The wet clothes had stopped being merely uncomfortable and had become a genuine emergency. She was shaking, hard, full-body shaking, the kind the body does when it's fighting for heat. And the shaking was exhausting, and the exhaustion was dangerous. Her hands had lost feeling past the wrists, and she was holding the reins through a combination of grip and will, and the will was starting to have to work harder than it should. She thought about the ranch house, about the stove in the kitchen, about the warmth of it, specific and particular, the way it smelled of wood smoke and coffee. She thought about it the way you think about water when you're thirsty, as a physical need that overrides everything else. She thought about Silas. He was in Casper, 2 hours away, minimum. Cutter had a bad knee and Pete was sick. Even if they had the ability to come for her, they didn't know exactly where she was, and the margin between where she was now and where she would be when the shaking stopped, when her body simply ran out of the resources it was burning to stay warm, was closing. She knew this. She had read enough about winter in the months before she came to know what it meant. She had simply never been inside the knowledge before. There's a tremendous difference between knowing a thing and being the thing. By the second mile, she stopped shaking, which was worse. The shaking meant her body was still fighting. The stillness that came after meant it had moved to a different phase, had begun making different decisions about which systems to keep running and which to slow. And the stillness felt from inside it like a strange and dangerous peace. The world went quieter. The snow-muffled silence of the landscape deepened, or she went into it deeper, one or the other, and Bess moved steadily beneath her, and the pewter sky was a flat ceiling above the white ground, and she thought, with a clarity that was actually the absence of clarity, the emptiness that the cold puts in the place where thinking used to be, that the sky was the same color as Silas's eyes. She was not sure, after that, how long she rode. She remembered the fence line appearing to her left, which meant she was close, which meant keep going. She remembered Bess changing pace, a shift in the gait that she registered as important without being able to say why. She remembered, or thought she remembered, the roof of the barn appearing against the white sky. She did not remember sliding from the saddle. She was in the snow beside the fence of the paddock, on her side, and she was not shaking at all anymore, which was the most dangerous thing that had happened to her today. And she was looking at the sorrel standing 20 feet away in the paddock. Looking back at her, and she understood with what was left of her understanding that Cutter had been right about leaving him there. The sorrel turned and went to the far side of the paddock and started making noise. The last coherent thing she thought before the grayness came in from the edges was that she hoped Cutter's knee was well enough to get across the yard. Then the gray came in, and after the gray, she did not think anything at all. Cutter heard the sorrel before he saw anything. He was at the bunkhouse window. He'd been watching the sky for the past hour with the particular unease of a man who has spent 40 years reading weather and doesn't like what he's currently reading, when the sorrel started up across the paddock. Not the usual noise of a horse that wants feed or company. The other kind. The kind that has a direction to it. He was across the yard in under 2 minutes, bad knee and all, moving faster than he'd moved in months, and he found her face down in the snow against the paddock fence with Bess standing 3 feet away, reins trailing, lathered and unhappy. He turned Evelyn over. Her face was the color of old wax. Her lips had gone a blue-tinged white. Her clothes were frozen stiff against her body. Not damp, not wet, but actually frozen, the outer layer crackling when he moved her arm, which told him everything he needed to know about how long she'd been in water and how long she'd been riding afterward. "Hell," he said quietly, to nobody. He got her up. She was not small, and he was 63 with a knee that felt like broken glass, and getting her from the ground to a point where he could carry her was an exercise in determination over physics that he would not have described as graceful under any circumstances. He got her across his shoulders in a kind of fireman's carry that put most of her weight on his better side, and he got her across the yard and through the kitchen door. He put her on the floor near the stove rather than trying for the stairs. The stairs were not going to happen with his knee the way it was, and she needed heat faster than she needed comfort. He stoked the stove up as high as it would go and started pulling her wet clothes off, working fast and without ceremony, because there was no time for ceremony, and she was in no position to have an opinion about it. He got her down to her underlinen, wrapped her in every dry blanket he could find in the downstairs of the house, and then went to put the kettle on and think about what else he knew about cold. He knew enough. He'd seen two men take bad water in winter in his years out here. One had made it, one had not. The difference, as best he could tell, had been time and heat and luck, roughly in that order. He didn't have a lot of time. He didn't have a lot of control over the luck. He had heat, and he used it. He got warm water into her. Not hot, because he remembered that much. You didn't go straight to hot. Holding her head up and working the water past her lips in small amounts. A patience-requiring business that he carried out with the grim focus of a man who has decided on a course of action and is not going to be moved from it. She wasn't conscious, but she wasn't gone either. She made sounds. Her body was doing things, shivering now, which was good, which was what he wanted. And the color in her face was slowly, grudgingly changing from wax white toward something closer to human. After 40 minutes, she opened her eyes. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, then turned her head and looked at him. He was sitting on the kitchen floor beside her, his bad leg stretched out straight because bending it was no longer an option, and he had a cup of warmed water in his hand and the expression of a man who has been very worried and is not yet prepared to stop being worried. "Fence," she said. Her voice was a wreck. "It'll keep," he said. She looked at the ceiling again. "How bad?" "Bad enough." He handed her the water cup. "Drink that." She drank it. Her hands were shaking badly. She used both of them. "Silas," she said. "In Casper. Can't reach him from here." He watched her face process this. "Pete's sick. I'll ride when you're stable." "Your knee." "My knee'll manage." He said it in a tone that didn't want arguing with. She closed her eyes. The shivering was getting harder, which he knew was a good sign. The body reclaiming itself, demanding its heat back. But it looked awful, the full-body violence of it, and he sat beside her on the kitchen floor and kept the stove going and waited. The sky outside the kitchen window had changed. It happened between one look and the next. 1 minute, the flat pewter of the established cold, the next something moving in it. A quality to the gray, a particular bruised darkness building at the northern edge that he knew as well as he knew his own name. The temperature had been dropping for the last 2 hours. He had not said anything about it to Evelyn when she left because she had made her decision and he didn't have the standing to override it, but he had felt it coming the way the old bones always feel it. A real storm, not a snow shower, not a cold snap, the kind of storm that rearranged the landscape. He sat on the floor and looked at the window and made calculations. Casper was 2 hours south in good conditions. In what was coming, it was longer going and longer coming back, and every hour of delay mattered. He needed to get word to Silas. He needed someone on a horse heading south before that sky made up its mind completely. His knee was not going to carry him there and back, and he was the only person on this property currently ambulatory. He looked at Evelyn. She was shivering hard, but her eyes were open and tracking. Can you sit up?" he asked. She tried. It took 2 attempts, and she used the stove leg to help herself, and she was shaking badly enough that the water in the cup sloshed over the rim, but she got herself upright and stayed there. "I need to ride for town," he said. She looked at him, then at the window. "That sky," she said. "I know." "Cutter, I'll move fast and keep to the road." He said it knowing she could see the flaw in it the same way he could. And he said it anyway because the alternative was doing nothing, and doing nothing was not something he was built for. "You keep that stove going. Don't stand up more than you need to. There's more wood inside the back door." She grabbed his sleeve when he stood. Her grip was weak, but she held on. "Be careful." He looked down at her. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and went to get his coat. He had been in the saddle for 20 minutes when he heard the wind change. He knew it before he felt it. Something in the tone of it, a deepening. The way a sound gets when it stops being preliminary and becomes the real thing. And then he felt it, coming out of the north like a wall moving across the land, pushing the temperature down another 15 degrees in what felt like seconds, and the first snow came with it not in flakes but in particles, horizontal and hard, and the road ahead of him went gray. He kept moving. He put his head down and kept moving. It was worse than he'd expected, and he'd expected it to be bad. The wind had the kind of violence in it that wasn't interested in the distinction between man and obstacle. It pushed at him and the horse with the same indifference it pushed at fence posts and scrub brush, and the snow it carried was dry and dense and reduced his sight to a cone of 20 yards in front of him on a good gust and less on a bad one. He had ridden in storms before. He rode in this one. An hour and 10 minutes after leaving the ranch, he came up on Silas Boone's wagon on the road. He didn't see it until he was almost on top of it. The snow had swallowed everything at distance, but Silas had stopped the horses because moving blind in this was how you drove into a ditch or off a grade, and he was sitting on the bench with his coat pulled up and his head down, and he looked up when he heard Cutter's horse. The two men looked at each other for about 1 second. "Evelyn," Silas said. "Not a question." "South fence, creek bank gave way. She went in." Cutter's voice was hoarse from the cold. "She's at the house. She's conscious, but she was in the water and then she rode. She was wet for a long time before I found her." Silas was already standing up in the wagon, looking south toward the ranch. Cutter could see the calculation happening on his face. Too far in the wagon, too slow in this. The road between here and there going from bad to impassable with every minute they talked. "Take the wagon," Silas said. He was climbing down before he finished the sentence. "I'll take your horse." "The road's—" "I know the road." He was already at the horse's head, and Cutter climbed down from the saddle with significantly more difficulty. His knee had set up badly in the cold, and Silas was up and moving before Cutter had both feet on the ground. "She's by the stove," Cutter called after him. Silas didn't answer. He was already gone, swallowed by the white within 30 yards, the snow closing around him as completely as water closes over a stone. Cutter stood in the road for a moment in the screaming wind, holding the reins of the wagon horses, and then climbed painfully up onto the bench and started the slow, careful drive back in Silas's tracks. The ride from where he'd met Cutter to the ranch took Silas 38 minutes. He would not have been able to tell you how he knew the road in the whiteout. He could not have articulated the combination of memory and instinct and the particular feel of a horse moving on solid ground versus the subtle wrongness when you've drifted. But he knew it the way he knew his own hands. He'd ridden this road in weather before. Not this weather, but weather. The horse was Cutter's bay, not his own, and the bay was not certain about any of this. Silas held him straight and moved him forward and didn't give him enough rein to argue about direction, and the horse moved, unhappily, but steadily, and the wind pushed at them both from the north with a constancy that after a while ceased to be an event and became simply the condition of the world. He thought about Evelyn the whole way. He thought about her in the creek, the particular cruelty of it, the bank giving way without warning, the water that cold, the distance she was from the house. He thought about her riding back. He had a very clear picture in his mind of what that would have looked like, and he kept having to put the picture away and focus on the road, and it kept coming back. He had known somewhere, not consciously, not in a way he would have been able to name that morning when he left for Casper, that she would do something like this. Not this exactly, not the creek, not any specific disaster, but the shape of it. Evelyn identifying a need and deciding to meet it herself, with or without help, because she was constitutionally incapable of watching a problem sit unsolved while she waited for someone else to address it. He had known that about her since the second week at the ranch. It was one of the things he had come to. He found the right word in the blank white space of the storm and looked at it honestly. Admire. Among other things he was not yet in the habit of putting words to. The fence line appeared to his left through the snow. He was close. 2 minutes later, the barn took shape in the white, and then the house, light in the kitchen window burning yellow through the storm, and he rode straight to the door and tied the horse to the porch rail. Not properly, just enough, and went in. She was on the floor by the stove, wrapped in blankets, sitting upright with her back against the wall and her knees pulled to her chest. She looked up when the door opened, and the relief on her face was so immediate and so unguarded that it stopped him for a full second, standing in the doorway in his snow-covered coat, the wind trying to come in around him. He pulled the door shut and crossed to her in 4 steps and crouched in front of her and put his hands on her face. Her face was cold, getting warmer. He could feel the difference from what it must have been, but still wrong, still too cold, and her eyes were glassy with exhaustion, and she was still shivering, though not as violently as he imagined she'd been shivering a few hours ago. "I went to the fence," she said, immediately, like she'd been waiting to say it. I know it was..." I should have waited, but the storm was 48 hours out and the post was gone and... Evelyn, his voice came out quieter than he intended. She stopped. I know why you went, he said. He was still holding her face. He was aware of that, and he didn't put his hands down. We can talk about the rest of it after. She looked at him for a moment. Then something in her face changed. The held-together look she wore when she was managing something, the competent surface of her, it slipped just at the edges, and underneath it she looked exhausted and frightened and very young, none of which she would have wanted seen under normal circumstances. And he was seeing it because there was nothing left in her to hold the surface up. I was in the water a long time, she said. I wasn't sure. On the ride back, I wasn't sure I was going to... I know, he said. I kept thinking about the stove, the kitchen. A breath. I kept thinking about this. She stopped herself. He looked at her. He knew what she'd been about to say. He was fairly certain she knew he knew. Neither of them said it. Let me get your temperature up, he said, and stood and pulled one of the blankets tighter around her shoulders before going to the stove to put more water on. What followed was a long night. The storm hit the house with everything it had by 7 o'clock, and by 9 the windows were opaque with packed snow, and the walls were doing the deep cold creak of a structure being tested. The temperature inside the house held. The stove was good, the walls were well built, and Silas was rigorous about fuel, but it required attention, constant feeding of the fire, and he gave it that attention through the night without complaint. He got Evelyn upstairs around 8. She protested on the grounds that she could manage on the floor, and he pointed out that she had been managing on the floor for 4 hours, and a bed was better for what her body needed to do overnight, and she did not have enough energy left to argue effectively, which was, he suspected, the only reason the argument concluded without a third round. He half carried her up the stairs, her arm over his shoulders, her feet working but unreliably. He got her into the bed and piled every blanket he could find on top of her and brought up a hot water bottle that he'd boiled the kettle for, tucked it against her feet because that was where the cold was still pooled. Your hands are cold, she said. She was half asleep already, her voice thick and slow. They're all right. You rode in that storm. Cutter flagged me down. He stood at the side of the bed. The lamp on the table threw a low, warm light across the room. I wasn't all the way to Casper yet. He rode out with his knee. He did. She was quiet for a moment. Then, he scared me. Going out in that... He shouldn't have... His knee. You can tell him that yourself tomorrow. Silas picked up the lamp to move it to the table by the door, where it would give light without being in her eyes. Silas, he stopped. Her eyes were half open, looking at him from the bed, and her hair was loose around her face, and she looked nothing like the woman who had stepped off the train in her green dress with her back perfectly straight and her face perfectly composed. She looked like herself, he thought, like the actual version of her that existed under the presented version, the one that came out when she was arguing about economics at the kitchen table, or laughing at something Cutter said, or standing at the fence line watching the hawk. I'm sorry, she said, for going without telling you. He looked at her. You told Cutter. That's not the same. No, he agreed. It's not. The wind hit the north wall of the house, and the lamp flame moved sideways and came back. Outside, the storm was doing what Wyoming storms did, asserting itself without any interest in what anyone thought about it. I wanted to show that I could handle it, she said. The honesty of it was undefended. The exhaustion had taken the armor off, and she was saying it plainly, the way she sometimes said things in the dark that she might have shaped differently in daylight. I wanted to be useful. You are useful. You do everything. You know everything about this place. I'm still... She stopped, reorganized. I didn't want to be something you had to take care of, something you had to work around. He was quiet for a moment. The lamp was in his hand and the room was warm from the heat rising from the stove below, and the storm was outside the walls. I don't think of you that way, he said. He said it without decoration, because decorating it would have made it less true. I haven't since the first week. She looked at him. The expression on her face was something he didn't entirely have words for, and he was not a man who typically reached for words when he didn't have them, so he let it be. Go to sleep, he said. Your body's got a lot of work to do tonight. He turned to go. "Will you stay?" she said. Quickly, like it came out before she'd decided to let it. "Not, you don't have to. The stove needs tending, I know. The stove will manage for a while," he said. He set the lamp down on the table and pulled the chair from the corner to the side of the bed and sat in it. It was not a comfortable chair. He'd built it himself 3 winters ago and had never gotten the angle of the back quite right. He sat in it anyway, and Evelyn looked at him for another few seconds, and then her eyes closed, and within minutes her breathing had changed into the slow, deep rhythm of real sleep, the kind that meant the body had taken over from the will and was doing what it needed to do. He sat in the chair and listened to the storm and watched her breathe. The night moved. He went down twice to tend the stove, moving quietly, coming back up each time to the chair and settling in again. She slept without waking, which was what she needed, and the color in her face slowly lost the last of its wrongness and became simply her face, the particular face he had spent 11 months trying to imagine from the evidence of her letters and had completely failed to get right in any detail, but had, it turned out, gotten right in every way that mattered. He had not expected her when she came. He had prepared himself with the careful pragmatism of a man who does not trust in outcomes he can't control for a practical arrangement, a working partnership, something functional and decent, if not warm. He had told himself that was enough, that enough was what he was prepared for. What he had gotten was something he did not have a prepared response to, and that had unsettled him for 2 solid months before he stopped fighting it and let it be what it was. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, the storm began to ease. The wind dropped by degrees, still present but losing the wall of force quality it had carried since nightfall, and the snow eased from horizontal to vertical, and then to the soft, gentle fall of a storm spending its last energy. The house went quiet around the sounds of the fire and Evelyn's breathing and the occasional settling of the structure in the cold. He sat in the bad chair and watched her sleep and thought about what she'd said before she went under. I kept thinking about this. The unfinished sentence, what she hadn't let herself finish. He thought he understood it. He thought, if he was honest, that he'd been carrying an unfinished sentence of his own for most of the past 2 months. The lamp burned low. He turned it down to save the oil and sat in the near dark. By morning, the storm was completely gone, as Wyoming storms often were, present and then absent, no transition. The sky by first light, a raw, washed blue above a world that had been remade in white. He stood at the window and looked at it. The ranch was buried to the fence tops in some places, the drifts architectural and strange, sculpted by wind into forms that would have been beautiful if they weren't also a significant amount of work. Behind him, the bed creaked. He turned. Evelyn was pushing herself up onto one elbow, blinking in the pale morning light, taking stock. She looked at her hands. She flexed them. She looked around the room and found him at the window, and they looked at each other across the small space of the bedroom. She was alive. He was there. The storm was over. "Cutter's knee," she said. "First thing," he agreed. And the ghost of what might have been a smile crossed her face, real and tired and slightly crooked. And he turned back to the window so she wouldn't see what was on his face when he saw it. Outside, the sky was the particular clean blue of a morning that didn't know yet how difficult the day was going to be, and the snow lay across the land in every direction, covering everything, making the world briefly and practically new. Cutter's knee took 6 weeks to properly heal. He would not admit this. He walked on it the morning after the storm with the expression of a man daring anyone to comment on his limp, and nobody did, because they all knew him well enough to understand that commenting would only make him walk on it harder. But Evelyn watched him cross the yard each morning from the kitchen window, and she counted the weeks by the gradual, grudging improvement in his gait. And when he finally stopped favoring it sometime in late January, she felt something release in her chest that she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She brought it up once, maybe 2 weeks after the storm, when she found him in the barn working a harness repair. "You didn't have to ride," she said. She had been thinking about how to say it for a while and had not found a better opening than the plainest one. He didn't look up from the harness. "Had to get word to Boone." "You could have sent the sorrel." "Horse can't talk." "You know what I mean." He set the harness down then and looked at her with the particular steady look of a man who has spent 60-odd years not explaining himself and is deciding whether to make an exception. "You're new to this country," he said, finally. "New to this ranch. People out here, when someone's in trouble, You go. That's not a difficult calculation. She looked at him for a moment. Thank you, she said, for finding me, for staying with me until... Don't thank me for that. He picked the harness back up. His voice wasn't unkind, just final. That's just what you do. She left him to the harness and walked back across the yard in the cold, and she thought about what he'd said for a long time afterward. That's just what you do. Said without pride, without expectation of recognition. Said the way Silas said most of the true things, like they were simply facts of the world rather than choices requiring acknowledgement. She had grown up in a world where people kept accounts, not always consciously, not with actual ledgers, but the accounting happened, the tracking of favors given and received, the subtle social economy of who owed what to whom and whether debts had been properly repaid. She had thought of it as normal. She had thought of it as how people worked. What she was learning, slowly, in the blunt air of Wyoming, was that there was another way. The winter after the storm was hard in the way that Wyoming winters were hard, relentless and indifferent, and occasionally beautiful in ways that had nothing to do with comfort. But it was different from the winter before the storm. Something had shifted in the ranch house, and in the two people living inside it, a shift too subtle to announce itself but present in every small thing, the way they talked in the evenings, easier and longer than before, the way Silas told her things without being asked, not private things, not yet, but real things, worries about the spring cattle market, his thoughts about expanding the north pasture, a memory of his father's farm in Virginia that came out one night by the stove while she was mending and he was sharpening a knife, offered without prelude and received without comment, let sit in the air between them where it belonged. The unfinished sentences on both sides began to get finished, not all at once, not in any dramatic conversation that resolved everything cleanly. It happened in increments, in the way that real things happen, a piece at a time, over months, until one day she looked at the accumulated pieces and understood that something had been built without anyone laying out the blueprints. He told her about his first winter on the ranch, 7 years ago, when he'd nearly lost the cattle herd to a cold snap he hadn't been prepared for. He told it without self-pity, but with the honesty of someone recounting a real failure, and she understood that the telling cost him something, and that he was giving her that cost on purpose. She told him about Philadelphia, about the years of dinners and parlor visits and the accumulating pressure of a life that fit the shape that had been cut out for it, but not the shape of the person living inside it. She told him about the sherry and Margot's party and the advertisement, and when he laughed, a real laugh, quiet but complete, the sound of it still something she had to work not to stop and stare at. She laughed too, and the story she had always half-dreaded telling came out of it smaller and lighter than it had ever felt inside her head. You were brave to answer it, he said. I was slightly drunk and completely reckless, she said. Those can look the same from the outside. He looked at her steadily. Doesn't change the outcome. She thought about that for a long time. Spring came eventually, the way it always does in the north. Not softly, not all at once, but in arguments. A warm week followed by a return of frost, the snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes first, the north-facing ridges holding their white into April while everything below them was already turning. The creek, which Evelyn had reason to remember with particular feeling, came up with snow melt and ran loud and cold through the south pasture, and she rode out to see the fence line she'd been trying to repair on the day the bank gave way, and found Silas had reinforced the entire creek section sometime in January, steel posts driven deep where the wooden ones had heaved. She stood at the fence and looked at it and didn't say anything about it when she got back. But she noticed it. That spring she wrote a letter to her friend Margot in Philadelphia. The first real letter, not the careful, edited versions she'd been sending since she arrived. She wrote it at the kitchen table one morning in April while Silas was out, and she wrote it honestly, which took longer than she expected. She described the ranch and the winter and the cold and the work. She described the creek, briefly and without excess drama, because the excess drama had worn off somewhere in the long recuperation after it, and what remained was simply the fact of it, a thing that had happened and changed her and was now past. She described Silas in a paragraph that she rewrote 4 times and eventually sent in its imperfect form because she could not find language adequate to what she was trying to say, and decided that the reaching toward it was better than the silence. He is not what I expected, she wrote at the end. He is considerably more difficult than I expected, in the ways that matter, and nothing like as difficult as I expected in the ways I feared. I do not know what I thought I was looking for when I placed that advertisement. Whatever it was, I did not find it. What I found instead was something I did not know to look for, and I'm still trying to understand it. I expect I will be trying for a long time. I am, surprisingly, not unhappy about this. Margot wrote back 3 weeks later. You sound entirely unlike yourself. You sound, if I'm being honest, better. She read that line twice, and then put the letter in the tin box where she kept the ones from Silas, and closed the lid. The conversation she had been circling for months happened in June, on a warm evening on the porch after dinner, the sky doing the long, slow Wyoming sunset that seemed to take hours and was, in her private opinion, one of the genuinely unreasonable beauties of this place. The kind of thing the land offered without warning and without any interest in whether you were prepared to receive it. She had been watching the light change on the ridge, and he had been watching the same thing, and the quiet between them was the comfortable kind, the kind she had come to know well enough to trust, when he said, without particular preamble, I've been wanting to say something. She waited. He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was finding the words, not stalling. When Cutter came up on the road, he said, when he told me what had happened, he stopped. The ride back was, I've been in bad situations out here. Weather, injuries, cattle going wrong at the wrong time. I know what it is to be scared of losing something. He turned and looked at her. That was different. She met his eyes. The light on the ridge was going orange and slow. How was it different? He looked at her steadily. You know how. She did know. That was the thing. She had known for months, had been knowing it in the way you know a thing you're not quite ready to say out loud because saying it out loud makes it real. And real things can be lost in ways that imagined things cannot. I know, she said. They sat with that for a moment. Not an awkward silence. Nothing like that. The silence of two people who have said the true thing and are letting it exist without immediately burying it under more words. I'm not going anywhere, she said finally. It came out plain, the way the best true things came out when she stopped trying to make them elegant. I want you to know that. This isn't me enduring something or making the best of a decision I can't take back. I want to be here. He looked at the ridge, then back at her. I know that, he said. I think I've known it for a while. Then why are you telling me now? The corner of his mouth moved, because I should have said it sooner and didn't, and I didn't want to wait until I found another reason not to. She laughed. It surprised her. The laugh, and the way it felt, the ease of it. He smiled then. The full version. Not the corner of the mouth restraint she'd gotten used to, but the actual smile, and it still changed his face completely, and she was still not prepared for it, even after all these months, and she looked back at the ridge because that felt safer. All right, she said to the ridge. All right, he said, and they sat on the porch until the light was fully gone, and the first stars came out and the air went cool enough that she pulled her shawl up, and he didn't go in, and neither did she. What came after wasn't simple. She would resist any accounting of it that made it sound simple. There were arguments, real ones with heat in them, about money and land decisions and the way he sometimes shut doors in himself without telling her, and the way she sometimes pushed at those doors when the better approach was patience she didn't always have. There were difficult winters and a dry summer that scared them both, the grass going thin in ways that kept Silas awake and put a line between his brows that didn't fully leave until the August rains came. There was a loss in the second year that she did not speak of to anyone for a long time, and that he carried with her in the way he carried most things, without display, but present, always present, the weight of him beside her solid and real. There was also this, the North Pasture expansion she had argued for, the one Silas had initially resisted on the grounds of capital risk, which turned out to be the decision that changed the financial shape of the ranch in the 3 years following. She had put the numbers in front of him twice, and the second time she had added a projection she'd built from 3 years of watching the market, and he had sat with it for a week and come back and said, "You're right," in the tone of a man who did not find that phrase difficult to say, and she had learned over time how rare that was. She ran the books. It was simply where the talent sat, and they both knew it, and once the pretense that this was a temporary arrangement was dropped, they stopped pretending otherwise. She was good at it, better than good. She had a mind that liked the patterns and numbers, liked the detective work of finding where money was going that it shouldn't and rerouting it. And the ranch benefited from this in ways that were concrete and demonstrable, which she knew because she built the demonstrations. He ran the land. Everything that happened between the sky and the soil, every decision about the cattle and the pasture and the water and the fences, that was his. And she had enough honest self-knowledge to understand that her competence in the office had no transfer to his competence on the land, which was deep in a way that could not be taught in any classroom she had ever entered. She learned from him constantly, and she stopped being embarrassed about what she didn't know, and he stopped up, if he had ever started, treating her learning as a deficit rather than a process. Pete Callahan stayed on. He grew, slowly, into someone worth keeping. It took a few more corrections from Silas and a couple of hard seasons that removed some of his excess confidence and replaced it with something sturdier. And by the time he was 23, he had become someone the other hands listened to, which was the real measure. Cutter worked the ranch for another 8 years before his knee finally sent him a message he couldn't argue with, and he retired to a small place in town that Silas helped him purchase. And Evelyn wrote to him every month until he died at 79, still apparently arguing with his doctor about the knee. Clara Webb became her closest friend in the territory. They were different women. Clara was warmer on the surface and more conventional in her expectations of the world, but the friendship held because it was founded on the kind of honesty that doesn't require agreement. They argued about politics over coffee and talked about their husbands with the frank practicality of women who had stopped needing to pretend those men were uncomplicated, and Evelyn was there when Douglas Webb died in the autumn of 1891. And Clara was there for what Evelyn had lost in that second year. And that kind of presence is its own language, without adequate translation. The ranch grew, not dramatically, not in the way of stories that want to make success feel inevitable, but steadily, the way things grow when they're tended by people who understand that patience is not the same as passivity. By 1890, they had doubled the herd and taken on 3 additional hands. By 1895, the Boone operation had a reputation in the territory that meant something, not for spectacle, but for solidity. The kind of place that made it through bad years because it had been built honestly and run the same way. Silas's hair went gray in his early 50s, first at the temples and then everywhere, and it suited him in the way that gray hair suits people whose faces are worth looking at. He kept the beard. She had long since stopped imagining him without it. It was simply part of the landscape of him, as familiar as the sound of his boots on the porch boards in the morning. She was 51 the last winter they had together. He was 54. He went in March, which was cruel the way all the real losses are cruel. Not during the hard part, not during any of the hard parts, but after, in the early promise of spring when you think the worst is behind you. A brief illness that neither of them took seriously enough, quickly enough, and then 3 days in which they took it very seriously, and then it was over. She stayed on the ranch. People asked afterward. Her niece from Philadelphia came out that summer, kind and concerned and clearly prepared to offer a return to civilization, and Evelyn found she couldn't explain it in any way that would satisfy someone who hadn't been here. The ranch was not where she had come from. It was not what she had planned. But it was, without question and without sentiment, where she had become whatever it was she had actually become. And leaving it would have been leaving that. And she had no interest in leaving that. She ran the operation with Pete Callahan as her foreman for another 12 years, until her hands got unreliable enough that she had to make different arrangements. And the arrangements were made, and the ranch went on. She kept his coat, the canvas one, the one he'd been wearing on the platform in Casper when she first saw him, and felt her stomach drop through the earth. She had washed it and mended it twice over the years, and it hung on the hook by the back door long after there was any practical reason for it to be there. And she walked past it every day without sentiment, or something that chose to call itself something other than sentiment, but amounted to the same thing. She was 73 when she sat down to write to Margot's daughter. Margot herself had been gone for 4 years, who was 28 and unhappy in a situation that sounded familiar in its particulars. The young woman had asked for advice, and Evelyn sat at the same kitchen table she had sat at for 44 years and thought about what she actually knew, as distinct from what she believed, and tried to be honest about the difference. She wrote for a long time. She told the girl about coming to Wyoming. She told her about standing on the platform in her green dress, with her stomach dropping and her plans for escape already forming. She told her about a week that became a month that became a life, and what it had taken to let that happen, and what it had cost her in terms of the person she had thought she would be, and what it had given her in terms of the person she turned out to be instead. She wrote, "The hardest thing I ever did was to stand still long enough to see clearly. Not to stop moving. I am not advising passivity, and anyone who knows me would find that particular advice absurd, but to stop moving away from something simply because it was not what I had imagined. Fear of the unfamiliar is the most natural thing in the world. It is also the thing most likely, if you let it drive your decisions, to keep you from anything worth having." She wrote, "I was wrong about him. Comprehensively, embarrassingly wrong, from the first second I saw him to the end of the first week I spent in his company. I had built a picture, and the picture was nothing like the man, and I nearly let the gap between them cost me everything. What I learned over a very long time, and not always gracefully, is that pictures are useful for imagining the future, but useless for seeing what is actually in front of you. For that, you have to put the picture down." She paused and looked out the kitchen window. The ridge was the same ridge it had always been, the pines on top of it the same dark line against the sky. She wrote one more thing and then signed her name and sealed the letter. What she wrote was this: "Courage does not always arrive wearing the clothes you expected. Sometimes it arrives wearing a dirty canvas coat and a beard that needs attending to, standing on a platform in Wyoming holding a piece of paper with your name on it. And if you are not careful, if you are not paying the right kind of attention, you will look at the coat and the beard and decide you know what you are looking at. You will be wrong. The things most worth knowing about a person are never on the surface, and the people most worth knowing are rarely what they appear in the first seconds of appearing. Stay long enough to find out who is standing in front of you. That is the whole of what I know." She put the letter in the post the next morning and walked back from the road in the early light, past the barn and the paddock, and up the porch steps and through the back door, past the coat on its hook, into the kitchen that still smelled of coffee and wood smoke, in the house she had come to from 1,000 miles away and stayed in for a lifetime. She put the kettle on. Outside, the ridge caught the first sun of the morning, the pines going briefly gold before the light settled into the flat bright of an ordinary day. Neither beautiful nor unbeautiful, simply the day as it was, asking nothing, offering everything it had, the same as it had always been. She made her coffee and sat down at the table and drank it in the quiet. And it was enough. It was, in the end, exactly enough.